In this last section, I want to do some analysis of the examples that I was just talking about and do it through the lens of Bourdieu's classification struggles. So, as I've kind of touched upon already, the hipster tends to equate with kind of middle-class cultures, and the way that they're kind of spoken about and used was kind of more reflexive, more ironic, and a more playful way, more often than not. On the other hand, the bogan was used much more kind of in a kind of forms of denigration and insult, a kind of cultural folk devil in many ways. So what I kind of argue that these things do is allow those that are kind of using them to label others or to make points about particular tastes and morals. It's a way of performing distinction in that kind of way that Pierre Bourdieu has written about and become so known for. So they're terms that are mostly pejoratives towards taste cultures that allow you to position yourself with some distance or superiority of them. Again, most of the time, some people use them more ironically themselves or identify with them, but for the most part, in the media at least, that's how they were used. In the media and in comedy, mostly the hipster provokes discussion, debate about things. And the bogan provokes mostly disgust and denigration. So again, like taste classifiers and classifiers that classify, these figures do the same thing. Figures classify and they classify. I mentioned earlier there's a kind of global, kind of local thing that goes on with these things as well, which again, I think interestingly maps onto class. The hipsters are more middle-class figure. Middle-class people tend to be more mobile, moving around the world. The bogan is more local. And tends to have its own version of it all the way around the world. So in terms of what these classification struggles play out online, I think the key question we need to ask, and this is what I was kind of doing in this analysis in the end, is like, okay, who benefits from this? And like, who's getting to kind of actually do the defining and do the kind of commenting and making the TV shows and stuff like that? And for the most part, it's, relatively privileged, well-educated, middle-class people. So what's at stake with these kind of opinion pieces and terminology use and all that kind of stuff is that those with the cultural capital, those with the symbolic power that are kind of in these culture industries positions and news positions and media positions and the like, kind of get in that Bourdieusian sense to, impress their own image on the world more. Their opinions and the way they position and define things are the ones that kind of are the things that therefore kind of dominate how things are defined in the kind of broader social world. So it's no surprise then that if hipster kind of culture, for want of a better way to describe it, the things that kind of attach to the hipster figure are more middle class. The people that are writing about them will have kind of more a social, tasteful homology with those things than the bogan that kind of tends to be a lower class and less tasteful and, less relatable to middle class people. So the different kind of, I suppose, even emotional and positional ways that these things are used kind of maps on to kind of who's doing the talking, who's doing the making. So when it comes to that, the hipster, in a way are the ones that are doing the talking. Middle-class people will have probably kind of closer tastes to that kind of sense. And I'd say some of the people, writing and making this stuff may have been called hipsters themselves, if you know what I mean. So there's a kind of taste and lifestyle social homology going on there. What this results in is the hipsters written about through irony, self-knowing, ambivalence. There's a reflexivity going on because the reflexivity is that there's very much similarities between the people writing this stuff and the things they're writing about. The hipster is still kind of problematic, but it's kind of problematic in the sense that it provokes debate about issues. So they're not so bad. The hipster's just kind of a silly kind of consumption clown. When it comes to the bogan's the one rarely doing the talking or doing the making or doing the opinion or doing the news. So there's a kind of social distance going on between the figure of the bogan and who gets to write and who gets to do stuff. So this means that there's kind of tends to be a much more symbolically violent relationship going on here. And the bogan's often used to kind of really kind of talk and be insulting about kind of those lower in the class system through these notions of objectivity and like pathologizing and individualizing kind of broader social problems onto particular groups. So the bogan's definitely problem-making as well, but not in this kind of silly, ironic way. They're, of course, the Bogan's apparently vulgar, aggressive, disgusting, undeserving, all these kind of things. So the Bogan therefore creates complaints and kind of concern about morals and fairness and downward envy that I'll get to in a minute. So for me, this is the way the kind of class is expressed in popular culture, in the news, in the media, in kind of public discourse. As I've kind of said and kind of written about elsewhere, that kind of class is not a term that's used a lot in public and in media and in politics, but it's kind of actually invoked a lot in other ways and through other things. So as Beverly Skeggs has written about, I think really beautifully, and it's been very influential on my own work, this is how class is made. These are how those kind of hierarchical relationships between morals and tastes, but also therefore between people, between groups of people, between suburbs and all that kind of thing. It's through these kind of relations and these kind of media productions and stuff like that, as how these things kind of come into being and kind of therefore reinforce, previous histories of these kind of class relations. Condenses a whole complex cultural history into every time these things are kind of used. What's important here, though, is that it relates back to kind of who gets to talk. The more powerful are the ones that kind of get to kind of make the world in their own image. This is what Bourdieu calls conatus, kind of way that kind of more people with more power, more cultural capital can define things and kind of say what's tasteful, say what's good, and therefore they get to promote more their own tastes as what's cool and legitimate and better, because they're the ones in the media and the ones in powerful cultural positions that get to do that. They also get to label other people in ways that they don't get labeled themselves as much. They kind of, what Skeggs says, imposes a fixity onto other people. They can kind of diagnose other people and stereotype them in ways that kind of can't happen in the opposite direction of the class system. Those that aren't in the kind of media and don't have a lot of cultural power can't do it the other way around. So again, this is how kind of class reinforces itself. So to kind of draw on Skeggs's work here, but kind of also paraphrase it myself, as she says, some people can use the classifications, characteristics of race, class, femininity as a resource. And I would kind of say that that's kind of what the hipster kind of end is doing, whilst others cannot because they are positioned as them. And that's what happens to Bogans in this analysis, I think. So in this sense, what the Bogan does is it allows people to express disgust about the world, disgust about people, disgust about taste, disgust about kind of injustice, disgust about violence, disgust about masculinity, all kinds of different things that are often rolled up into the different discussions of the Bogan. So again, as Steph Lawler's work on the disgusted subject points out, I think it's an excellent paper to be looking at here. Middle-class people often need to kind of distinguish themselves from others by saying what they're not. I am not that kind of distasteful thing, and they can position themselves as being, having better morals, better tastes. So the kind of figure of the Bogan is useful for that kind of work. Kristeva's kind of philosophical work around this, about the objectified other, I think is another kind of way of thinking about what the Bogan does. And all those kind of figures that Tyler points out, in Australia as well, we've had, the boat person and the dole bludger and all that kind of stuff does similar work. So it's pretty straightforward symbolic violence analysis here. The Bogan is kind of used to do symbolic violence with, but the hipster's a little bit more complex. As the hipster is a figure that's kind of more correlated to those kind of doing the writing and the opinion, I think the hipster expresses a different kind of anxiety. And this relates to kind of notions of happiness, how consumer culture works, but also how precarity is kind of moving up the class system. So, less qualified, kind of so-called unskilled work has always been more precarious than kind of higher education, professional managerial work. But that precarity is actually moving up the system now to where many jobs in the past, professional qualifications, are now harder and harder to get full-time work. Short-term contracts, casual work is actually kind of starting to dominate those realms as well. And so this, for kind of middle-class people that have done all the work, got the degree, got out into the world, there's a sense of injustice going on here. You feel like you've made all the right choices in that kind of youth transitions thing, but then when you get there, you're still kind of unsatisfied and not secure and, can't buy a house and all this kind of stuff. So I think the hipster in that sense allows a kind of debate to go on around what's good and what's right and what's tasteful and what's moral. But also expresses some other kind of anxieties as well. There's a kind of cruel optimism going on around both the figures here that, like, you know, relatively high cultural capital, middle class people have done all the right things, but it hasn't kind of paid off. So there's a kind of cruel optimism in terms of Laurent Bralant's work there. So the Bogan kind of taps into this in a sense of, like, there's particularly the kind of cashed up Bogan, there's a kind of downward envy that goes on. People that have done all that kind of educational stuff feel resentment towards these kind of apparent people that haven't done all the work that I've done to get the high paying job, but are getting that anyway. And look what they're spending it on, like jet skis and bad cars. It's not fair. The hipster kind of is a little bit different in that sense, in that it kind of allows the middle class people to kind of be reflexive and laugh at their own ambivalent situations and their own kind of, you know, what are kind of absurd taste cultures, you know, like having to like pursue a boutique beer from a particular country or whatever and all that kind of stuff. But there's kind of therefore a recognition in that ambivalence of the cruel optimism of pursuing happiness through consumer culture. And much of the kind of writing around the hipster in particular express these kind of ambivalences and this kind of ironies in that sense. The hipsters are kind of, as I said, a consumer clown. So both of these things are kind of a threat in that kind of figurative sense that Tyler writes about, I think. The mobile hipster kind of illustrates that kind of threat of the new precarity, the overload of irony and all that kind of stuff, and the impossible of being original in pop culture today. The Bogan, that pretty much straightforward, denigrative, lower class people apparently have worse values and morals and have vulgar culture and all that kind of stuff. They're both very much Borgesian markers of a sense in one's social place. But they reinforce this in a couple of different ways. So they're both a kind of sense of one's place in the class system in terms of that social homologies and distances that are kind of related to how you would use them. If you're more kind of, I suppose, effectively related to hipster or Bogan culture, you know, you'll kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about there. They also kind of relate to, I think, generationally to things. The hipster kind of is written about often by older people in the media. So they're kind of writing about the newer generation of their own class that, like, in that kind of similar way that always happens, older people kind of denigrate what younger people are doing. So again, that kind of similar relationships going on there that I was talking about in youth studies in general. So I won't go into this slide as much detail, but like, firstly, the figure of the hipster and the Bogan allows discussions of class to take place without actually talking about class. The figure of the hipster and Bogan indicate blurriness of these class relations, like the boundaries between them are blurry, but they also do mark the boundaries as well. And as I've just kind of mentioned, the figures in the hipster and Bogan kind of mimic and reproduce those traditional moral panic kind of perspectives, particularly between generations. So to finish, when it comes to kind of the humorous side of this stuff as well, as Critchley, I think, quite eloquently points out, a joke that feeds on ignorance starves its audience. So that kind of denigration of people below you in the social system is kind of cheap, and it kind of says more about the people making the jokes, I think, about the people than about the people that are being parodied. But this is a kind of shows all too how political aesthetics are. And it highlights kind of how these relations kind of happen every day in the media, but we don't actually think about them too much through these lenses. And I think it's important to constantly consider the class relation of the way that the media works and what it represents and who benefits from that. And to conclude in that sense, I think the figures of the hipster and Bogan kind of act as a kind of dog whistle for, you know, our broader reflexive anxieties that are going on about the way the world's changing and our place in it. Okay, I'll leave it there for this week. Thanks.